Hi, everyone. My name is Shuang. I am a CSPC program committee member, and I just wanted to acknowledge that CSPC is taking place on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin, Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. And we respect these traditional hosts and want to thank them for allowing us to have this conference in their place and space. So next up, we're about to hear from a wonderful panel talking about equity and anti-racism in science, an approach for augmenting Canadian science and technology. This panel is organized by Natural Resources Canada. Coincidentally, I also work for them. And just wanted to remind you, I'm sure you're all tired of hearing it, but please don't forget to tweet us either at Science Policy or hashtag CSPC and fill in the evaluation survey at the end of the panel. We would definitely appreciate the feedback. So I just wanted to pass it off to Dr. Sharma to kick off the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Equity and Anti-Racism in Science panel. It is indeed exciting to be here with such a distinguished members of our panel today. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am participating. We are all participating from the traditional unceded territory of Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We are grateful for the opportunity to honor their long history and to be able to have this conversation on this territory. As I was introduced, I don't have to go there. My name is Ranjana Sharma. I'm the Chief Scientist of Natural Resources Canada. Very delighted to be here today and to have a very open conversation and an active conversation on this topic. So looking forward to it. Racism, discrimination, and inequities are an ongoing challenge faced in science and technology. And there is a pressing need to be able to, first of all, recognize and then to have strategies in place to address these issues. Just wanted to give you a bit of what is happening at NRCan before we delve into this panel. At NRCan, our department strives to be more inclusive in different ways, including our corporate-wide objectives through our dedicated Office of Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility that aims to embed inclusiveness within all our programs and policies, the science and technology ecosystem, such as the way how to incorporate EDI into ways of working and into the research scientist progression, career progression services. Thank you. We also have a science and technology internship program which aims to close the gap and increase interns from employment equity groups. We also have opportunities to educate on inequities at the working level in my own team, for example, Office of Chief Scientist, where we meet on a bi-weekly basis to discuss various things, including insights, challenges, assumptions, and encourage diverse thinking. But this is a new area for us as well, and so we are learning as we go. And it is every opportunity is a learning opportunity, I would say. So before we dive into the panel discussion today, I would like to see by the show of hands how many of you folks are from academia. Awesome, quite a few. From industry. We have a few hands here. And from the government. Quite a few there. Wow. So we have a good mix. So this conversation is hoping to be you can take pieces from it. And I'm also looking for having your contribution in this active conversation. So looking forward to that. In terms of what to expect from this discussion today, I'll provide an introduction to each of our panelists here, and they will share their perspective and experience. And this will be followed by a discussion with the panel. And for the rest of the session, we will like to hear from you all. It's very important. And so we'll open the session for Q's and A's. And in case you want to share your challenges and experiences, we look forward to hearing from you. Just to add, I was just told a few minutes ago, there will also be an interactive session using the conference mobile app. So there will be a couple of questions we'll ask you on this app, and if you can log in while we are starting, that'll be great. So with that, with the introductions set aside, I would like to introduce our first panelist, which is Ms. Angeline Sosai Pillai. Angeline is a Vice President of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, EDI, at MyTax. She provides strategic leadership on EDI and Indigenous initiatives to advance inclusive innovation in Canada. A big role. Before joining MyTax, Angeline was a director at the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion and has previously served as a professional development lawyer at the Ontario Bar Association, where she launched the first series of inclusive leadership programs designed to accelerate a culture shift in the legal profession and justice system. Not an easy task. Very happy to have you here with us, Angeline, today. And over to you for an introduction and to share your experience on your topic at hand. If you wish to share your slides, you're very welcome to go to the podium or do it from here.
I'm going to be seated. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you so much, Ranjana, for a very warm introduction, and it's such a pleasure to be here today. So, the slides stopped advancing after that. I guess you really need to read our purpose, mission, and vision. That's an interesting one. Am I pointing it in the wrong direction? Oh, there it goes. Okay. I'm giving away all the good content. Okay, so what do we do at MyTax for those of you who may not be very familiar? Our platform is essentially built on relationships. So we connect industry and talent from academia, and we're funded by government. So we sit right in the middle of our audience here today. And we essentially create opportunities for talent, so from students in academia, by creating innovation research opportunities in industry. And we have a very expansive network. I've listed off some details there. So over 9,000 private sector and not-for-profit organizations, over 11,000 researchers. We work with post-secondary institutions across the country. And unlike our historical roots and origins, where we were very focused on graduate studies, we've opened up to undergraduates and colleges as well. So lots of innovation happening, both in Canada and internationally through our network. So at MyTax, we're always rethinking innovation. And we're very committed to inclusion. I would say that the development of my role as the inaugural VP of EDI is a testament to that. I report directly to the CEO, so there is that direct link to the very top leadership of the organization. We have a strategic plan that very boldly has committed to two corporate values, which are EDI and decolonization. No easy feat. And because of this, I have a dedicated team of advisors. So 2 Indigenous relations advisors, 1 advisor of EDI as well. So we work across the nation, and we're just getting started with developing an action plan. But because of our bold strat plan, there is organizational-wide conversations about this. But we know, and we've began to collect a lot of disaggregated data. We know that there are several gaps of underrepresented groups, specifically in STEM. So how do we navigate this? Our approach, and again outlined in our strategic plan, is to steer inclusive innovation by design. So we have created barrier reduction initiatives for participants in our programs. So one of them is that we don't have a citizenship or permanent resident requirement to access funding for MyTax programs. So that's huge for participants to be able to immediately participate without that barrier. We've broadened our eligibility beyond traditional post-secondary institutions in academia to include all levels, starting from colleges, but also all disciplines. We're open to research outside of STEM. And I think that can be conceptually quite challenging for people to wrap their minds around. How do you innovate outside of technology? Really ensuring there's cross-collaboration in innovation by bringing all disciplines together. That's one of the approaches that we take. And we recognize that financial barriers are huge for certain participants. Specifically for Indigenous participants, we offer enhanced leveraging to reduce that financial burden. And through that, we've seen tremendous increase in participants, Indigenous participants participating in Indigenous innovation. So one of the challenges for us, though, is that we serve post-secondary institutions only. And we know that there are a lot of barriers well in advance of that. So there are several barriers for students in high school. And this is why, even though it's not part of our mandate to work with high school K-12, we partner very strategically with organizations that do have that reach. And I don't want to steal Madian's thunder, but Canadian Black Scientists Network is one of those partners who do have that high school reach that we don't have. They have the social capital, they've got the network. So we essentially partner with organizations such as CBSN to expand diversity in our participation. So that's a little bit about Mitex.
Thank you, Angeline, for sharing various strategic partnerships that you have at Mitex. We'll move on to the introduction of our second panelist, which is Dr. Harpreet Kochhar, who was appointed President of the Public Health Agency of Canada in October 2021. As well, since late 2020, he's leading as a Deputy Minister Champion for the Science and Technology community. It is largely in this capacity that he will be speaking with us today. And just to give you a bit of a background, Dr. Kochhar has held various management positions across government, including Associate Deputy Minister of Health, playing a major role in Canada's COVID-19 response. And prior to that, he was working as a ADM in the Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, and prior to that at CFIA. So we are really privileged to have you here today, Harpreet, and over to you for sharing some of the work you're taking.
Thank you very much, Ranjana, and bonjour à tous et toutes. Ça m'a fait un grand plaisir d'être ici parmi vous. It is indeed a pleasure, and I am happy to note that you have a great interest. That's why you are in this room. So certainly looking forward to a little bit of a enhanced discussion, if I may, on the pieces. I don't know if the slides are going to move themselves. Oh, I have to see my, just in case you forgot, that is me, right? So allow me to begin by acknowledging that we are speaking from the traditional territory of Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Her presence reaches, back to the time immemorial. And the land acknowledgement is close to my heart because we need to, because much of our diversity and inclusion work includes a bigger network which we create by inclusiveness, at least for the traditional people. My introduction as such described my roles and functions very well for the purpose of our discussion today. I think what I need to mention to you is that I am a scientist by profession. And that's the one piece which actually prompted the unique experience steeped in management and science. The clerk of the Privy Council tagged me with this: you are the DM champion for the science and technology community. So, which I happily accepted. Now, this is one of those which I would want to mention to you, that the role of champion, for most part, is very much by extension to work with DM community. And the DM community is not just basically, talking to only the deputy ministers. It is about strengthening what is the role of really increasing the reach of science in both federal and other entities. And I pause and put some emphasis on that, because one of the things is government supports the delivery of programs and policies with different science-based departments and agencies. 14 of them have come together as a part of the DM community, which spearheads that component of really looking at that, what is the particular focus and how can the cross-cutting and horizontal issues be judged. So this is one of those which for me, it is an important one. Now, I can tell you one thing, and this is one of the pieces. We really brought the community together and wanted to know what are the priorities. The principle is bite what you can chew. Don't create so many priorities that you are unable to deliver on any of them. So the three which we chose specifically And the first one, which was anti-racism in science. The other ones being science security, as well as the third one, which was more related to intramural science, what happens in the organizations, departments and agencies and federal government, how can we connect them to the extramural science? So I actually thought one of the key component was, where are we focusing? And one of the key priorities I took on and the whole of the community took on was to put emphasis on anti-racism science. And that's not only reaches inside the federal government, but has a reach around. So I'll spend a couple of minutes. Acting against racism is what we define about methodically identifying what is assessing, preventing, reducing the bias, as well as looking at the design, conduct, and communication of and use of research, science, as well as related activities. Complex definition, but tell you this encompasses what we actually want to deliver. And science excellence actually demands anti-racism science. And I want to kind of emphasize that because this is an important piece. I'll say this, and having spent a lot of time, with the Public Health Agency of Canada and health portfolio in general, basically the appointment which I had was on April 1st, 2020, when the things were going like this on the pandemic side. So I will give you a few examples which are very specific to what happened, what transpired during that time. You will recall that during the pandemic, we really focused some of the research on certain biological racial differences. And those explanations for differences in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality were tagged by the race, not those health determinants, which could be associated with the conditions, the housing conditions, the low income, the food insecurity, and geography and lack of healthcare. What does it point out? It points out that you are tagging it to the color and not to the social determinants. That builds in the bias. And you could very easily look at it from that, that's racialized and other populations have had that impact. But what are the conditions which actually perpetuated that? That's an important piece. And we, flip side, you cannot just disassociate that component from the biological pieces, but that's not how you present it. That's not how you assess it. And, one of the key things when we actually were, remember the time when there was a lot of ventilators and all the other stuff which was in use, and people wanted to really assess the blood oxygen level for those who were suffering from COVID-19. And what we realized was that the blood oximeter, which go on your finger and actually measures your pulse oximeter, were calibrated for those individuals who had lower melanin, which is fair skin. And when you put it on a dark skin, they gave you a very different reading. Can you believe? There's an unintentional piece in it, but that is where we could focus in and actually look at the science. So I'm going to mention this to you. Anti-racism science, maybe I will be on, So anti-racism science is not disregarding race in our science, but it is like looking at interpretation and communication of those societal realities. And it includes what we say, how do we actually assess that in the workplace? The workplace, which includes the science folks, those who bring the scientific rigor to our work which we do. So it is not a role of racialized and indigenous scientists only to come out and say there are certain changes in which we should be focused on. It is actually an organizational strength to have diversity, bench strength diversity on the scientific level so that those biases are actually taken out and they are built in. We have a lot to unlearn and relearn about this one. And that's an important factor because what we are seeing are, unintentional biases, but they are built into our system. Now, I'm going to say this in terms of, our science workforce. Sorry, am I on a wrong slide? Can't even. Yeah, anyways, I'll actually move on a little quickly. There is a when the clerks call to action, and those who are from the government, and I saw many hands out there was a call from clerk to action against racism. And that call actually looked at it from an angle, what needs to be done and what are departments doing in that context. When we took as a community of science and technology, the DEMs, we focused on what are the lived experience. What do we know about it? What is the baseline? We can look at the public service employee survey and we can only get an aggregated data, not a disaggregated data. You'll be astonished that all the parameters which are there, they may not point out to a specific component. So what we are actually looking at, and we did that with the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Health Canada, we wanted to actually really hear from the scientists, from those racialized and other scientists, as to what are the lived experiences. And those which include, and which were pointed to us, were systemic bias, in hiring and promotion practices. That's a very individual HR kind of thing. Overall expression of racism in workplace, and this is typical to science. Science needs not to be tainted with racism. And then marginalization and lack of representation at multiple levels. So I draw this attention to you because this is what promotes that inherent marginalization, which does not allow the racialized and other scientists to work in that way, which actually is inclusive. And we need to really focus on those areas. And then finally, one of the things which I would say is an important one is, sorry, I am on this slide. Yes. So one of the things which we are focusing on is, how do we actually take it from here? What is it that we really need to do? And what we really need to do is actually look at the opportunities, how we can bring that to the fruition. Recruitment, retention, and training. These are the 3 HR pillars which need to be totally unbiased. There are other times when you are looking on the whole, what is your ability to actually influence the system? Health Canada, Public Health Agency, DRDC, many other departments and agencies are actually focused on first education and then change management in that context. And finally, I would say there are pieces which as a champion for science and technology community, I don't lead a community of only deputy ministers. I lead a community which has a reach out to many. Leadership is a behavior. Leadership is a behavior that can and should be demonstrated at all levels and in promoting and demonstrating equity and diversity. And that's the message which we provide, and that percolates down. It is at times very hard. I'll leave you with this one. It is very unsettling for some people, and me included, when you hear about diversity, inclusion in the science, when the speaker is neither the scientist nor a racialized person. So bring in that lived experience. Bring in that experience which actually allows you to hear what is the baseline on that. So really focusing on that, that is our intent. Conclude, I would say there are different challenges, there are different barriers, but we can help each other. And this forum, I think, will open a few of those curtains, and it will allow you to see through this and say, what exactly can we do as a team sport in the EDI function? Thank you very much. Mercy Migwich.
Thank you, Harpreet, for sharing some of the federal aspect of anti-racism and equity in science that you're leading. And I can vouch, having participated in some of the meetings on the DM panel, it's a very active group which wants to make a meaningful difference. So really good work. From federal work, we move on to an academic scenario now with our next speaker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Median Andrade. Median is a professor at the University of Toronto. Sorry, I should have taken a pause there. So as I was saying, Median is a professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Biological Sciences. She's serving as the Canada Research Chair in Integrative Behavioral Ecology, quite complex from my angle. As well as she heads several committees, including National KILAM Program Selection Committee and Scientific Advisory Committee of Council of Canadian Academies. In addition, Mediane has also served as Vice Dean, Faculty Affairs at Equity, related to our panel today here, as well as is an acting dean for the University of Toronto, Scarborough's 16 academic departments. She's a co-founder, very interestingly, she's a co-founder and president of the Canadian Black Scientist Network, a national coalition for Black inclusion in STEM. Thank you, Mediane, for being here today, and I'll turn the stage over to you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm actually not going to talk exclusively about academia. I'm going to talk about Black inclusion in STEM. And I'm really going to be talking about the Canadian Black Scientist Network. And I see that puzzle piece that showed up in Angela's because what I'm talking about is the fact that many of us who are Black, whatever sector we're in STEM, are the lonely only, often the only one in our group, on our floor, in our department. And what we need to do is to think about how to change that reality. For me, at the University of Toronto, we have calculated that for about 10 years, I was one of 3 Black women in STEM at the entire University of Toronto. And on my campus at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, which is very much in favor of equity, I was the only Black tenured person in STEM for 17 years. It's not because Black people aren't interested. It's not because Black people don't want to get involved in STEM. It's because the system filters us out. And science does have a racism problem. There are structural problems. There are problems both in terms of the way in which the structures do not expect Black people to succeed, but also because there are no checks and balances that prevent bias from filtering people out. And some of us are engaged in education to try to prevent that. And many of you are also engaged in those efforts, which we need to make progress. But I just want to show you that we've only just started looking at the data. It's hard to see the data from here, but essentially what this shows you, and you can go take a look at the CIHR and NSERC dashboards, which I'm very happy that they've started to share with us. People who identify as not as visible minorities, as racialized people, in all of these categories. So with CIHR over the course of 3 competitions, with NSERC across these different ranks, have lower granting success than do people who don't identify as visible minorities. There's no error bars on this, and there's no tests yet, and we've only been collecting the data for a short time. But every single one of those points is in the same direction. And SSHRC has also recently published their data and show the same thing. The United States, they've been collecting these data for decades and show a consistent gap, racialized gap, in granting success, much of which can be explained by apparent race, not by how many papers you publish, not by impact. So we have a problem. And the solution to the problem is being pursued in a variety of different places with vigor. I do think Canadians are people of goodwill trying to change things. The problem, as I say here, is there's very little accountability at a national level. There's little coordination. People often don't know best practices, nor do they know how to reach out to Black communities without that act seeming racist in some way. One and done is common, right? You have a program, it's funded for a short time, and then it disappears. And in addition to that, there's no broad educational efforts with a consistent message across all our different agencies and sectors and institutions. And so the problem here as well is that the community involved, Black scientists, are few and far between and are often not involved in these processes, at least not till the end. Oh, we've got some money for Black fellowships. Will you guys help us decide how to roll them out, right? So why is it important that we're involved? It's important because Black professionals, Black scientists, are at the center of every level of change. Students have to see us. Students have to know there's a pathway for them. They have to know that people have already made it. Graduate students need to have places where they can go to do their research and be mentored by someone who understands their context. And that can include members of the dominant statistical majority who have been educated about how our experience differs from theirs. But sometimes students just need a safe space where they can go and say, you really know what I'm going through. I don't even have to tell you about it, and you can help support me to find a mentor. Statistically, people of color, and especially Black and Indigenous people, have a harder time getting mentorship and sponsorship and getting research opportunities than do people from the statistically dominant group. So we need programs for this. We think the solution is a national organization, and that's why the Canadian Black Scientists Network was found. The Canadian Black Scientists Network is a national organization. We are just striving to, I'm not bilingual, we want to be bilingual. That will come. And essentially what we want to do is say, okay, we need something national, and especially because we are the lonely only in most places, we need a national network where the 500 of us who are members can stand up as an example to students across the country. And we want to also create national nodes that understand regional realities who can connect personally with individuals in those areas. And those are the things that we're working on right now. And really our vision is to increase the flow of Black youth into STEM fields through making sure that those barriers, like being placed into applied classes rather than academic classes, even when they're qualified, that those barriers are removed. For those of us already in the field, to make sure that we have equitable funding and awards. And in addition to that, to make sure that we are actually speaking with the people who are making policies. So this is not one and done, but sustained. We have a youth branch, as Angeline alluded to, and Kevin Hewitt, sitting in the audience there, spoke to it on another panel this morning. We are a region, a national region with Youth Science Canada. We're one of only 2 such regions. The other is an Indigenous national region. Black students from anywhere in the country can come to our science fair and be mentored by Black scientists. And we invite others to come and help mentor them as well. And we're trying to connect organizations across the country that engage in this kind of work, outreach with Black youth. Our conference last year, the Black Excellence in STEM Conference 2022, was very successful. We had 1,500 registrants. On the right, you can see in black the proportion of Black attendees, but you can see the other colors. We don't want to be in an echo chamber. We want you to learn what we do. And this is an interdisciplinary conference. If you say we want to hire Black scientists, come to our conference and meet them, right? It's about relationship building. In the academic context, they tell us there is no pool. And I say the pool is not applying to your jobs because they're afraid that there will be entering a racist environment. It has to be relationship building. On the left, you can see that we have students all the way from sort of the grade school age right up, because we do have our science fair as part of our conference. We had a special guest last year, unfortunately not in person. Okay, so what's the problem here? What's the challenge? The challenge is not community engagement. The challenge is not the work that needs to be done. The challenge is that we have no sustained funding. And every time I talk to people about that, including MPs earlier today, yeah, we know it's all program-based. Yeah, we know every not-for-profit has to apply for 12 grants a year. Yeah, we know it's a real bummer. When people say we need to wait and throw up their arms, they're talking about the lives of children being lost. We've lost generations of children. So that's what I'm asking for. Stop throwing up your hands. Figure out how to fund us. I'm willing to write the grants. I just don't want to write 12 of them every year. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Median, for sharing your initiatives at Canadian Black Scientist Network. Very touching. And the amount of work that has gone behind the scene is tremendous. So thank you for sharing that today. We have, I'd like to now go on to our final panelist, Ms. Sadia Muzaffar, who is joining us who's a founder of Tech Girls Canada, the hub for Canadian women in science, technology, engineering, and math. Sadia is also a co-founder of Tech Reset Canada, a group of business, technologists, and other residents advocating for innovation focused for the public good. She, in her own role, is a technology entrepreneur, author, and a passionate advocate for responsible innovation and immigrant talent in STEM. Before I pass on the stage to her, one last tidbit from your bio, Sadia. In 2017, she was featured in Canada 150 Women as one of the most influential, groundbreaking women in Canada. Quite an achievement there. Sadia serves on the board of Women's Shelters Canada and is on the advisory panel of the University of Guelph's Center for Advancing Responsible and Ethical Science, AI, in particular. Over to you, Sadia.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
All right. I had to walk up here because I was all the way in the end and I couldn't see the slides. Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be part of this conversation. What I would like to share with you today is only part of the work that Tech Girls Canada does. We have been focusing on immigrant women in STEM for the last 5 years. And the reason why we got to doing that was because as part of the Women in STEM advocacy work, we found that there wasn't a national benchmark study that could tell us how we were doing there. And you could ask why that specific focus. A lot of you will know that Canada has a very specific kind of immigration plan. Immigration is a big economic pillar for us, and our immigration criteria actually chooses STEM qualified individuals from all across the world very specifically. They get extra points, so there's an incentive for them to be here. So as a result, we have some of the best minds from across the world come and want to make Canada home because we have selected them. And we have not spent resources educating them. They bring tremendous international experience. So this is really what you would call the cream of the crop. So it was a little surprising for us to not find any data on immigrant women who are qualified in STEM. So I'd like to share a little bit with you today. So nearly 1 in 3 women in STEM is an internationally trained immigrant in Canada. Immigrant women make up close to half of Canada's total women in STEM workforce. Immigrant women in STEM are 13.47% of Canada's total STEM workforce. Now, you know that women are missing in STEM sectors, and that has been known for a really long time. But given that, this is a significant number. If we took out immigrant women from Canada's STEM workforce, the total number of women left would be reduced to 16%. So less than 2 women in a room full of 10 people who are working age in STEM. That's a number that I hope you agree is unacceptable for us. So we're having a conversation about equity and anti-racism, and a lot of the focus is intersectional, right? A lot of the things that Median talked about play into immigrant women. So we think that immigrant women in STEM are such an interesting and critical case study because they're not just women, they're visible minority, immigration status plays a role in there, and STEM. So if we can look at the barriers there and try and address them, the result could be really, really helpful and have a far-reaching effect. So in 2018-19, for about 2 years, we went across Canada, all 13 provinces and territories, and asked these women, what has your experience been like? We were looking for answers for many questions, but 2 big ones. The first one was, how are labor market outcomes for immigrant women in STEM impacted by the size of their region's economy? And the second question was, have there been material changes that correlate to better labor market outcomes in the nature of the supports that are provided to these women so that they can integrate in Canada's labor market? So the answer to the first one, it's an enduring belief that if you land in Toronto, your chances are better of finding work than if you landed in Saskatoon or if you were in a smaller place. What we found was, in all 13 provinces and territories, the barriers that these women are facing are the same. It actually did not make a difference what the size of the regional economy was when you listed the overall barriers. So that was surprising. The second thing that we wanted to know was, how have supports evolved in the last 20 years? We wanted to know if things have changed. And the short answer is no. They haven't materially changed when we correlate them to labor market outcomes because they are still very squarely focused on this magical 2-page resume. Every immigrant who goes to an immigrant serving organization is told, your resume can't be more than 2 pages, as though that's some kind of key that will unlock a job for them. So these people who come with years and years of experience spend an inordinate amount of time and a lot of money making their resume 2 pages. and still get no callbacks, right? So we have to look at the data to have a real conversation about these things. So what I would ask you to consider is this. In a lot of these conversations, we talk about intentions, and intentions have a place, but they're literally the lowest bar. I think we're at this point where we need to have conversations that go beyond intentions into actions and accountability. That is really, really vital right now. Women overall, I would say, are over-mentored and under-sponsored. Everybody likes to give women a lot of advice on what to do, and not a lot of them will give us money to do what we know how to do well. So I hope that in this conversation we can talk about how inclusion is about power. Somebody somewhere needs to make the decision to include someone, and they're inherently in a powerful position. And if we don't talk about power, we're talking about intentions. And you can be really well-intentioned and still have, not good results to show. The last thing that I will share is, if anything that I shared with you today surprised you and you would like to get more involved in this national conversation, on January 24th, we are organizing a conference. It's virtual, and I would really love to have more of you be part of that. So if you could go to techgirls.ca, you can register, and I hope to see you there. Thank you.
So thank you, first of all, to all our panelists for sharing some of the work that you have been actively involved around this topic of equity and anti-racism in science. Coming from various backgrounds, we can see there are differences, definitely, but more importantly, there are similarities as well in the experiences and perspectives of our speakers here. For example, the funding challenge. It is consistent. It is there. You might have heard it from each one of us here. The unlearning and the learning experience, we know what we have to do, but it's a matter of putting that into practice, for example. So with that, I will like to now kickstart a bit of a discussion here with one question. And then I want to change the format a little bit. I'm going to open the Q&As to the audience rather than asking pointed questions to our panelists, if that's okay with the panelists. So I'll kickstart with the first question, which is, if you were to look at a system, organization, or an individual level in this topic, what goals related to equity and anti-racism in science should our science communities be working on to achieve? So what goals should we be looking at, and how can we work toward those goals? So I'll open the discussion with that question, and maybe we'll begin from here and we'll go on to the end of the table. Angeline, if you can kickstart us on that.
Yeah. So I would begin. Can you hear me? I would say I think it's really important to focus on early intervention. We talked about the lack of representation throughout. I think all of the panelists touched on this, attracting. We think a lot about attracting talent, retaining talent, advancing talent, but there's also a lot of barriers to getting the talent that we want to attract, right? So thinking really early. I think if this is a priority for the science community, we can't wait until people have entered post-secondary to say, okay, who do we have here? We need to be looking at this far sooner. So early intervention, starting in high school, getting students to think about what prerequisites they need to take. I think on the other end of that, a complementary piece I would share is we need to promote BIPOC people into positions of influence so that as we're trying to draw in that talent throughout K-12, they're seeing people who look like them. They're seeing opportunities. They're seeing role models and mentors. And those are the people who could even be sponsors. They need that. So I think on both ends, it can't just be about bringing more people in. It's promoting people up into leadership and positions of influence.
Thank you, Angeline. I'll pass this on to Dr. Kocher now.
Yeah, so I'll speak from the federal, science aspect, and I must acknowledge that we saw, as I mentioned earlier, PCOs, clerks call to action. The call to action has to result in action. Call to action is not something which you put on a paper and say, these are my aspirational goals. These are to happen, right? You can go on a PCO website and look at all the departments and agencies, what they are proposing to do. Our intent should be to actually measure that in terms of where we are. And that is what we need to do. In our, my champion role, that is what I am proposing. Let's have that data. Where is the baseline data? Because what do you compare it with, right? What are the behaviors which we are influencing, changing, and what are we doing? Inclusiveness and diversity into science, STEM, that is only visible when your yardstick of in the recruitment, retention, and promotion actually starts to show a little bit of movement. And that needs to really resonate with the public opinion research, and I call it loosely public opinion research. It is PSES, or the public service employee, where that dissatisfaction level goes down and you are actually seeing more of those racialized employees or others in those positions of influence, as I heard, or, where they are, I noted this term, which is that they are not over-mentored and under-sponsored. I think this is resonating with me so much, Harya, and finally, I'd say one of the things which I thought was an important one was the systemic racism is actually on the radar. Now, remember SGBA Plus in 1995 when we started that concept? And it was novel, it was slowly. Today, when I send a memorandum of cabinet or a treasury board submission, unless there is an SGBA Plus complete assessment, it doesn't go any further. In few years, we would say, are we looking at the EDI lens? And that is what would be the criteria. I'm hoping that will happen soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm not sure I'm on. Okay. Thank you so much for that. Exactly. I agree. We need the data. I find it strange that people who work in science forget about data when we talk about EDI because it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. So we need the data to understand where the challenges are. We need to make sure that we have key performance indicators that are reasonable given where we are currently and where we want to go. And then we need to build the key performance indicators into our evaluation of performance of leaders. So there's no way around this. And it can't just be diversity as a statistic. There have to be other measures of KPIs. So, for example, whether your employees feel that their abilities are being fairly assessed, whether they feel there's a fair opportunity for promotion given the opportunities they get, who gets the glamour work and who gets the grindstone work in your group. This is something that tracks with racialized status and with gender quite often. Grindstone work being stuff that's not going to get you promoted that has to be done. Glamour work being the stretch opportunities allows someone to say, yes, that person should get promoted. So I would love to see, I don't believe in a corporate model most of the time, but this time I believe in it. If you had a product that wasn't selling that you think should sell, you would do the data tracking to figure out where the problems are. You would try some things, and then you would look at how it rebounded or whether it worked. And we just don't do that with equity, and there's no reason why we don't do that with equity. We need to start doing it.
So I'm going to build on what everybody here has shared. We do need data. I also think that we are drowning in data. There are things that we have known for many, many, many years. I don't know what arbitrary line of data we are wanting to cross to action those things. And I think it's really important to have a frank conversation. That's why I'm saying that the conversation actually needs to be about power. People who have the authority to make these changes are not interested or inclined or incentivized to share that power. Unless that changes, all of this work will butt up against structures that have been designed to keep us out. And in that, I think it's really important to talk about risk. A lot of the people who are doing this work of inclusion and anti-racism are also on the margins. What they are foregoing or risking is huge compared to people who ought to be taking up this mantle and talking about these things. So I'll give you one tiny example. In academia, there are tenure track professors, right? The reason why you have tenure track is because you should be allowed that protection to push for things that are, let's say, unsavory for those who are in power or how things are set up. So many of the conversations that we had across Canada with postdocs who were immigrant women, whose immigration status actually relied on them keeping that postdoc, was saying they were in terrible working conditions. They were in terrible working conditions and they couldn't change. They couldn't get out. That's why it's really important to talk about all of these factors, right? You could be a visible minority woman whose immigration status is not precarious and you would have the choice to leave. When we talk about this kind of stuff, we need to talk about who's taking the risk, who's being asked to take the risk, and what the cost of that is. Because that, to me, is the data that we're not counting. We're not counting what the overall loss to somebody is who took a stance and then was never promoted. They got assigned to grunt work. So I'm hoping that we can also interrogate those of us who should be doing this work, and how we can hold them to account. And all of us know these people.
Thank you so much to each and every one of you. There are so many. I'm going to open it up for Q's and A's from the audience. But before I do that, just to recap, there are so many layers of this. You know, when you're in a private sector, you face a different set of challenges compared to the federal government and the academia. But regardless to say, you know, that the EDI lens should be embedded in some of the work that we are doing as a marker. As Dr. Kocher said, he cannot submit something unless it has the GB analysis. We need to embed some of these thinkings and walk the talk, is what we are hearing here. So with that, I think there are some, it'll be good to get some questions from you folks. We'll gather a couple and we will give it to our panel. So I think there are mics around at the back, maybe. Or in the front, sorry. There's a mic in the front. Please come along. Yes.
Hi. So I work in science policy. Sorry, I wrote this down because I'm kind of nervous to speak. I work in science policy, and I think science policy is a driver of change for science and tech innovation. Some of you spoke about hiring and promotion. How would you handle a hiring manager telling you they don't want to hire from diverse pools of talent because it discriminates against the majority?
That's a big one. That's a big question. Would you like to take it, Median?
These are common objections to equity initiatives, and here are the answers. I'll send you the paper. I will send you the paper, but one of them is white men can't get jobs anymore. Statistically, you can demonstrate that to be false. One, right? Statistically, it's incorrect. What is true is that the groups that are doing it well are moving closer to the statistically dominant group getting jobs at the rate that represents their proportion in the pool. And as someone once said, when you're used to being on top, you know, equality looks like oppression. So you show the statistics, I'd say one. The other piece is the reason we have special programs in the human rights code of every province in this country is because it's not discrimination, it's redressing an imbalance. And if you have a hiring manager who doesn't understand that, you're at risk, I would say, of running afoul of some of these guidelines. So the first one, though, I'll send you the paper. So come up and talk with me after. Oh, yes, I'll do that. Absolutely. I'll do that. Good idea. I'm at Widow Web. Because of the spiders.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to the, yes, perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to each of the panelists for your contributions. And my question relates to what Sadia was saying at the end with the margins. And I think with any sort of initiative you want to start, if it's for whether it be women in STEM or racialized communities in STEM, there's always this that you need to be the one to make it happen. And you have a lot of draws on your time. So what can allies do to help take some of that weight off of your shoulders?
Thank you for the question. I think that like so much of the work that is ahead of us, not just with, you know, inequality, with climate change, et cetera, the piece that we're missing is relationships, right? It's really difficult to enter a trusted partnership of any sort when you've not had a relationship before. And I think that's where the hard work is. That's what's gnarly, right? Because a lot of people, I think 10 years ago when TGC started, it was not so trendy to talk about diversity and inclusion. And now I would argue it's almost too trendy to talk about it, right? We're talking a lot, but we're not really focusing on the change. So a lot of this, I think, has to live in a place where you have a relationship with somebody, which is not somebody on a panel, right? It's a one-on-one conversation. And a lot of this work for allies actually lives with each other. So if you are part of a privileged group, you need to talk to your people, right? And you need to actually interrogate it together. And this is less about, calling somebody out or in. It's more about making this a shared thing. Because if you do this work, within your own community, as an example, the South Asian community has a huge anti-Blackness problem, right? This is my responsibility to take up with my community so that a Black person doesn't need to be in a position where they're like, that thing that you're talking about, colorism or what have you, they don't need to do that work. So I think for allies, it's really important to refocus instead of coming to the mic to actually go in the background and set up the structures or dismantle them.
All right, thank you very much.
Hi there, thank you so much for this. I represent a national nonprofit, so funded by millions of tiny grants, organization that supports people living with HIV and disability. And so much of what you're saying resonates because we're all intersecting, government and academic, and we work with academic institutions to build evidence and research to support people living with, various challenges. One of my questions for you is, where does disability play into your EDI plan? Because we talk a lot about this. I just literally did a webinar 2 hours ago on Zoom about HIV and disability resources. People with disabilities are largely not the focus of sexual health and HIV prevention. This is funded by PHAC for me to find those resources and see if there are linkages. But my question is, where, if anywhere, does disability land in your equity and diversity and inclusion planning?
Maybe I'll take it one little more so, if I may, and that is because one of the key component of this is integrating the two pieces. The piece of what you're talking about in the HIV and disability, the government functions in such a way where for STBBI or sexually transmitted bloodborne infections, that's what we call in public health agency, those are specifically funded in a very specific grants and contribution scheme. It has to have that linkage with ESDC, which is actually developing a disability action plan. And that is precisely what is happening. So I can tell you, this is not a cabinet confidence or anything, but very lately, and there's a World AIDS Day coming on December 1st, we actually really had a very solid conversation in terms of how do you bring these two things together and how does the intersectionality work so that folks who are actually focused on those specific pieces, like whether it is HIV, disability, they don't have to actually guess where do they have to go. There has to be a single window approach that would be very, very beneficial. Is that there? Are we there? My answer is no. Can we be there? Yes. And are there forces working on that? Yes. And specifically the nonprofit organizations who are bringing it up as such, they are very helpful for us to really make that point and really make that point in terms of making sure that this thing is connected. Like, that's my best answer to this one because, I wouldn't want to go into the details of what goes where, but this is something which is actually on the radar and has an active, force behind it.
Can I just say one thing? people of color tend to be overrepresented in communities of disability, and also the way in which they are treated when they have HIV is different, right? Especially Black people. There's a lot of studies on that. So we're developing a strat plan over the next year, and this is one of the things we want to tackle. Intersectionalities are very important to us, and especially those members of our communities who are at even more of a disadvantage because of these kinds of intersections. So not yet, but it's coming.
Absolutely, thank you.
And Angeline has something here.
I would just add, it's exactly what Marianne was saying about, marginalized communities or people of color. There is often a disproportionate number of people with disabilities as well. And it depends on how you define disabilities, right? Is it because it can be so far reaching? It could be mobility, mental health, physical health. There could be chronic health conditions stemming from societal imbalances. But I would say from where I stand and how it fits into the action plan that I'm currently working on developing for our organization, we've explicitly identified persons with disabilities as a priority group. And I think if you don't name your priority groups, you're not going to get very far in EDI work. So it's the 4 designated employment equity groups plus LGBT that we've added. And we're really taking an intersectional approach to that work. And I think it needs to be embedded within our systems. So the first thing we recognize that we're not as far ahead as we'd like to be is that our processes and our systems aren't even accessible to all people with disabilities. So that requires an audit. That requires a financial commitment. It requires looking at, and this is not glamorous work, right? It's not something you can kind of showcase to the world and say, hey, we did an accessibility review. It's not a product. It's not something flashy. But I think the hard work is never glamorous. So I would say that's an important piece, is making your processes actually accessible. And that's a priority for us, and we're working on that.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for bringing that perspective. It's always nice to hear different layers to this.
Could I add to that too?
Yes.
Oh, please do. I just realized
go
I'm
sit
white
down
lady.
because I'm like, she's been standing there.
I don't want to take up the space, but
Oh.
I want to hear from you.
Your specific question was, where does disability? It belongs everywhere, right? I'm new to learning about this as an able-bodied person, but what I'm learning is the perspective is that we are all going to encounter these issues, right? We have an aging population, we have inequality, and a very specific example of that ties into what I was saying earlier is if you look at the Ontario disability payments, they are atrociously low. And the reason why they're atrociously low is because we think that disabled people are over there and they're not us. Unless you have a loved one or yourself who's actually dealt with the system, it's really hard to know how difficult and inaccessible it is and how not sustainable it is anymore. So one of the things that we can do, regardless of what sector you belong to, is public pressure, right? I think we need to really get behind that as residents and push for these things to be better, because we can make the accessibility good, but if it's not enough to sustain somebody living on their own, it's something like $1,200 a month in Ontario, which
$1,280,
right? That I can't even imagine how you would pay rent, food, cell phone, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we need to have a really frank conversation about how EDI actually lives in all these spaces and what it actually looks like, not just representation, but, the sustainability of these systems. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you all so much.
Hi, so my question kind of touches on a point Sadia brought up. I used to be a postdoc, an immigrant postdoc, so I speak from experience. So one of the jobs that you can get in Canada without getting a labor market impact assessment is a postdoc, because you can't find Canadian postdocs, so you hire foreign nationals. However, once you're here, the degree of exploitation that happens on these postdocs, who are, mostly people of color and/or immigrants, is insane. And the thing is, like you said, your literal ability to exist in Canada is dependent on this job. So it's hard to leave the job. That's the first problem. And even if you want to leave the job, getting another job outside of academia especially, which is the, boys club, becomes a big issue because they always want you to show Canadian work experience. It doesn't matter, like you were saying, Sadia, like around the world, you can have experience, but you are required to have Canadian work experience for a lot of these jobs, whether explicitly or implicitly. So what can the Government of Canada or we as a society do to address that, in the sense that we're bringing these people here who are incredibly talented, who are entirely capable of doing the jobs, but if we are going to put so many roadblocks in front of them and exploit them to the point that they have no choice but to leave Canada, there's a huge issue there. So what do you think the government can do? And obviously it's up to all the panelists. What would you say the government should do? And what do you think, universities don't do much in terms of protection for postdocs. So what do you suppose the government can do to address this concern?
So this is a very important question because it's a reality of the world, right? And so I'll pass on to the panelists if they, Medine, if you're from the university perspective, you want to share something. But from my personal experience, I think it's that change that needs to be it needs to be highlighted, because if we don't highlight the issue, how else can we get the traction? Exactly. But I can't speak to the specifics of it, so I'm going to pass it on to Median and Sadia and others.
I go first. So there's a few different things. One is, of course, it's illegal to ask for Canadian experience. So people who are actually hiring managers or in a position to educate hiring managers need to start taking that seriously. We need to start looking what the pool looked like before, and then what the shortlist looks like, or who's hired. So really meaningfully looking at what we're doing in terms of hiring is important. At University of Toronto, postdocs are unionized now. So in many places they are voting to unionize, and it's for reasons like what you just described. And so I think that is one of the protections, or one of the ways to be protected. But of course, you still need a letter from your employer, so it's hard for you to act if that's the case. In more and more places, they're also, instead of just having places that, like they have offices for graduate students, more places are starting to have explicitly offices that protect postdocs.
I can tell you, they are
ineffectual.
They're there. They are there as the advocate for the university. They're not your advocate. Right. So their job is to protect the university, not protect the postdocs, not support the postdocs. Everything is for the university.
I would say unionize.
We are trying.
I mean, it's actually hard on us when you're unionized, but I'd say unionize. The ones of us who are good to our postdocs, but I don't think there's anything other than collective action that will fix that, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Everything Median said. Unionize. Or collective action. Collective action can look like so many different things, right? You don't necessarily even need to be a formal union to walk out en masse to protest something. Protest is a right that is protected under our Constitution. The trouble that we run into is postdocs are in this weird limbo, right? Exactly. So they are not part of the immigration stream the way that others are. Their work is also not work, right? So you don't pay into like the things to get recognized. It's very bizarre. And I know that there is work going on across Canada to bring attention to this. It's taking too long for the specificity of the problem and how common it is across institutions that are very, very similar. The solution needs to come quicker than it is. And that is to actually look at how exploitative the setup is, right? So no matter who gets into it, if you're lucky, you don't run into a lot of problems. But if you're not, there's nowhere for you to go, right? And the immigration status piece is the thing that makes it hard. I think a lot of people wash their hands of it. They're like, well, this is immigration. Like, I can't do anything. I'm just like a prof at a university. But it's so prevalent that I think that there needs to be noise and there needs to be pressure, right, for this to change. But thank you for sharing.
Thank you, guys.
I'm reluctant to pitch in. I worked in immigration for 3 years. So I have a little bit of a different perspective, but I'm not disagreeing with any of my colleagues. But I'm wanting to tell you there's a different way of how immigration system works. The immigration system, whether it is express entry or federal skilled workers or others, is based on a numerical system. And the numerical system actually takes into consideration your age, your education, your English or French language training and all. there is also that piece which you can work, like other than unionize, there is a piece which can be actually lobbied, and again, IRCC will hate me when I say that, is to actually have an NOC, the knock code, actually identify postdocs as the valuable skill. And that knock code actually bumps you up so that and I can tell you one more thing, which is not very clear to the general public. If you are not being treated properly for the work you have been hired, you can actually go back to IRCC and they will give you an open work permit. I guarantee you, because that is a legislation piece which I actually instituted on that.
See,
so that
kind
is
of thing
something
should be made more
Dr.
publicly
Kochar,
available knowledge.
Dr.
And
Kochar, why is that a secret? Why is that a secret?
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding.
I will also acknowledge that IRCC, compared to especially the U.S. immigration system, is very smooth. And I actually did the express entry, which is how I was able to leave my job. I got a permanent residency. But I will give IRCC credit in this. The express entry program does make it easy for postdocs to immigrate to Canada.
Thank you. So this is a very informative session in more ways than one, actually. So thank you for that. We'll have 2 more questions, and then we'll open it up to a poll that we have. I'm being told that we need to go to the poll. So over to you for the...
Thank you all, esteemed panel. It's really great to hear your views. Median, it's great to meet you in person. And I'm from Genome Canada. My name is Kokwak Bosaya. And my question really just surrounds some of the discussion we've had today, both in this panel and in the earlier panel on science and exclusion. And my question really is around data, because we have this obsession with scientists. We like data. Data is good. It's good to have baseline data. But it doesn't take much sometimes to know, like Median talked about being the only Black tenured scientist in her group. When I was at University of Manitoba, there were 2 Black scientists in medicine. I think many, many years ago, I'm not very young, there are still 2, right? So we know what it is. People who fund projects here, funding organizations that are in this room, know who they're funding, and they're neither Black nor Indigenous. So we know some of this information, yet we want to collect the data, which is good. Like, we don't collect data in Canada. So my question really for the panel is what else can we do? Action, similar question I asked in the earlier panel. What else can we do alongside collecting data to accelerate inclusion? Because there's a clear exclusion of minoritized people in whether it's, we talk about having power, being in positions of power, and when we look at a lot of the organizations that are here today, and we look at their board of directors and their senior management teams, it's quite homogeneous. So what else can we do to accelerate the inclusion that would lead to more diversity and equity in some of those rooms? Thank you.
Okay, which of our panelists want to take that on?
So I didn't mean to say collect data instead of action. Now, let's just put that on the table first. I agree with you. The reason we need data, I've done equity education for about 6 years, and I will tell you that until George Floyd was murdered, I could not say Black in Canada. People did not think Black was a thing. They didn't think it was different. They didn't think the legacy of slavery had anything to do with how we were being treated or that there were deficit narratives. They always gave me a what about. So that's one piece. We need the data to convince scientists that their judgment is not ironclad and absent bias. It's really important. They don't believe it unless they see the data. So that's one piece. The other is we need to have special programs. That is why it's in the Human Rights Code of every code in the country, because the special programs allow you to say, we're actually going to say, you know what, in the government service, you need to speak French. Maybe not as many Black people come in speaking French, Canadian born at least, people from Africa do. But anyway, and so maybe then there's a program for them to learn French. I know that some ministries already have that in currently. Is there actually a special program to build the relationships to hire the people? Is someone looking at the data on recruitment and promotion to make sure that there's no filter? Let's just be really clear. If we have a process that is fair, and that includes opportunities to show that you can be promoted, That includes opportunities to develop your skills and professional development. The statistical representation of people in the application pool should match the hiring pool, should match the promotion pool, should match the pool of leaders. The Human Genome Project tells us there's no genetic difference among us, right? So if we are actually working at this in the right way, there are statistical indicators of whether or not we're doing what we should be doing. If there's no one available to promote from those groups, then you need to do more professional development and more opportunities at the level that's feeding into that level. So my gloves are off in this room because I think we need to do things. We're tired of waiting.
So I can just add very briefly to that, coming from the federal side, I know that the DMCST group that we are working on is quite active in terms of our milestones, what we want to achieve, and a strict timeline in terms of where we want to go over time. So quite an active community that is thinking of how can we make a difference? How can we walk the talk? How can we make it into tangible outcomes that can really, be useful for the community at large? So we'll pass it on to you for the last question.
Thank you. My name is Olga Peña. I'm from the Public Health Agency of Canada. This is a great discussion. The discussion really appealed to me because as an immigrant woman in science that has been in Canada for several years, as a mom and a student that was here as a PhD, I have to go through all these struggles. I left academia because of the same issues that I never saw a Latina as an associate professor. So I look into other opportunities. Luckily, I'm now in government, which I also found that there are lots of different challenges as well in that environment. But one of the things that I wanted to share is that I'm tired as well. I'm tired. I have been activist on this for several years, and I'm just tired of seeing such a slow action happening. So one of the things that, and I broke down, adding to the pandemic, I broke down basically. So one of the questions that I have specifically that I'm trying to actionize in my own role that I am right now is that I try to entangle mentorship with sponsorship. So what kind of strategies can we put in academia, in government, in industry, where you can bring these 2 points together for managers, for directors, for really, bring that into action as a real thing? Because I don't see that happening. So what kind of strategies can we do in that sense?
I mean, sponsorship is so much about sharing power, right? You're saying, I vouch for this person. I believe in this person's talent. I think they should be given a chance. That's what sponsorship is. And I think a lot of people are very reluctant to do that for various reasons, right? Somebody over lunch was sharing with me how her lab supervisor is close to retirement, is in his 60s, and very clearly and overtly says, I don't need to change anything. She shared that the first thing that she was told in the lab was, no husbands, no babies. And this is a young person. So this is not long ago, right? This is our reality right now. So there's a sense of entitlement there that I think speaks to an inherent insecurity. And I'm going to go a little bit meta, and I hope that that could be a good note for us to end this on, is to say our allegiance to how things are done is over-indexed. Things can change very quickly when we want to, right? So we have all these protocols and bureaucracy, and it serves a really good purpose sometimes to slow things down for consideration. But it can also have this gatekeeping effect, right? And you can both be somebody who is disadvantaged in a system and be somebody who is pushing it forward onto others. So I think that accountability is a personal kind of accountability, to do an audit of where you sit in this, mix of things. And we really need to believe that we can change stuff. How quickly did everybody go online when the pandemic was happening? For years and years and years, when accessibility advocates were saying we need to have different ways of people to learn and work, that was, oh no, we can't do that. Security, Overnight, we were all working from home, or a lot of us were working from home if you were not a frontline worker. Things change very quickly, and I think that belief is very essential to engage in this, because if you're really tied to how things were, and that's where your identity is, and if you can't reconcile the past and where we've come from, especially in Canada with the violence and genocide that is in our very recent history and continues today, you're feeling guilty or shameful is not going to change it. You taking action and putting yourself on the line a little bit is where the change is going to come from. So I hope that we can all do that in small and big ways.
So we will have time for maybe one last question or two. But before that, I'm told that we have a bit of a poll here. If you can please open your conference apps. There are 3 questions. We would love to hear from you as to what you think. So the first question is, give you a few seconds to open up. The first question is, immigrant women are equally likely to be STEM qualified than Canadian-born women. Let's see where we are. I guess I'll get a sign when the poll is closed, Mercedes. Yeah, maybe? Okay. So we are seeing about 64% saying true and about 36% saying false. The answer for this is actually B, which is false, which is immigrant women are twice as likely to be STEM qualified than Canadian-born women. So a bit of a disconnect there. But
I like how sly this room is because I already gave them the answer earlier.
Okay. Let's move on to the second question, just in the interest of time. I'll let you read it. Factors such as culture, education, language, life experience, and the media influence us all, impacting our preconceived ideas that frame how we see and interpret people and the world around us. These are the biases, some conscious, some unconscious. Are you aware of your biases to be able to avoid them? Okay, for this one, we have a no right or wrong answer. It is your perception, and thank you for answering this truthfully. Moving on to our last question on our Q&A. Based on the panel's discussion today, do you feel better prepared now to pursue or promote equity and anti-racism in science? And again, we have all work that we can do within our small communities. This is not a testing question. It's just to reflect on our learnings today. Thank you for that. All right. We are inching very closely. Actually, we are 2 minutes past our time. Before I thank our panelists, just want to ask if there's any lingering question from any audience, one pressing last question at the end. Okay. If none, I would, before I thank, I would like to say that this was a very interactive session. Really learned a lot from each and every one of you, the panelists. If there was a word cloud, and if I were to describe a few things that I learned today, starting early is important. Leadership is a behavior. We need to have a sustained effort and funding, which is very important. And we need to have those KPI performance indicators for our leaders so that we are held accountable, so that we can bring about a change. Those are some of the key things that I took over. I'm sure you must have your own lessons that you might take away from here. So as a conclusion, I want to thank each and every of our panelists today for taking the time and participating in this very timely and important conversation. I hope that we learned from this and we will put some of the things in our practice. And thank you to each and every one of you for taking the time to be here today. Thank you very much. Hope you have a wonderful evening.